Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of May 24th, 2019, dawned over Shire Green, a quiet northern suburb of Sheffield, South Yorkshire, like any other spring day. Parents readied their children for school, neighbors exchanged morning greetings, and the rhythms of ordinary life pulsed through the residential streets. But behind the walls of a semi-detached council house on Gregg House Road, a horror beyond comprehension had already unfolded. By 7:30 that morning, emergency services would receive a call that would shatter the illusion of normalcy and expose a twisted family secret that had festered in darkness for years. When police officers arrived at the property, responding to urgent concerns about the welfare of children inside, they discovered 6 young souls unconscious, their small bodies bearing the trauma of violence that no child should ever know. The scene that greeted the first responders was every parent's nightmare and every officer's worst call. All 6 children were rushed to Sheffield Children's Hospital, where medical teams fought desperately to save them. For would survive, their futures forever marked by the events of those terrible hours. But for 14-year-old Blake Barris and his 13-year-old brother Tristan, help had come too late. The 2 oldest children would never leave that hospital. Within hours of discovering the children, police arrested 2 people at the scene. Sarah Barris, the 34-year-old mother of all 6 children, and Brandon Mackin, a 38-year-old man initially identified as her half-brother. The charges were as grave as they come: murder and attempted murder. As investigators began piecing together what had happened in that house, they would uncover not just the horrific details of how 2 young boys died, but a web of deception, incest, fear, and a plan so chilling it defied belief. Sarah Barris and Brandon Mackin had conspired to murder all 6 of their children. To understand the tragedy that unfolded in May 2019, one must first understand the foundation of lies upon which the Barris household was built. Sarah Barris appeared to neighbors and social workers as a struggling single mother, doing her best to raise 6 children on her own. She frequently reached out to social services, asking for help with her children's behavior, presenting herself as overwhelmed but loving. Visitors to the home would later report that she seemed devoted to her children, though they also recalled a disturbing refrain she would sometimes utter: "I gave you life, I can take it away." But Sarah Barris was harboring a secret that colored every aspect of her life and the lives of her children. Brandon Mackin was not simply her supportive half-brother helping out with the kids, as everyone believed. He was her lover, engaged with her in an incestuous relationship that had lasted for years, and he was the biological father of all 6 children. Sarah and Brandon shared the same mother, making their relationship both illegal and deeply taboo. The children themselves had been raised on lies. They were told that their father had died in World War II, an impossibility given their ages, but a story they accepted because they had no reason to question their mother. They did not know that the man who visited their home, who sometimes helped with their care, was not just their uncle but their father as well. This fundamental deception created a household where truth was flexible and reality could be rewritten to suit the needs of the adults in charge. For years, this arrangement remained hidden from the outside world. Social services had been involved with the family on and off, responding to Sarah's requests for support with her children's challenging behavior. A serious case review conducted after the murders would reveal that no one, not social workers, not teachers, not health professionals, had any idea of the true nature of Brandon Mackin's relationship to the family. Sarah had successfully maintained the facade of the struggling single mother, and Brandon played the part of the helpful relative. But as the children grew older, particularly Blake and Tristan, the boys began exhibiting behaviors that concerned their mother. Whether these behaviors were connected to the dysfunctional environment in which they were being raised, or simply the normal challenges of adolescence, Sarah interpreted them as threatening. More importantly, as social services became more involved in trying to help the family, Sarah grew increasingly paranoid. She feared that her secret would be discovered, that someone would ask the right questions about paternity, that the house of cards she had built would come tumbling down. In the weeks leading up to May 2019, Sarah Barris's fear transformed into something darker and more desperate. Social services continued their involvement with the family, asking questions, offering support, conducting assessments. To Sarah, each interaction felt like a tightening noose. She became convinced that the authorities would discover the truth about her relationship with Brandon, that they would take her children away, and that everything she had worked to hide would be exposed. Sarah confided her fears to Brandon. The two of them discussed their options, turning over increasingly desperate scenarios. In messages to a friend, Sarah wrote with chilling frankness about her dilemma. "I've thought of every possible solution to this mess. Mass murder, putting them all in care, checking into the local nut house." What might have seemed like dark humor, or the venting of a stressed parent, was actually a window into the disturbing calculations happening in Sarah's mind. According to testimony that would later emerge in court, Sarah's primary motivation was control. She could not bear the thought of her children being taken from her and raised by others. She told Brandon that the children would be better off dead than in care. It was a perverse logic, one that placed her own fear and need for control above the fundamental right of her children to live. Brandon, bound to Sarah by blood, complicity, and their shared secret, agreed to help her. Together, they formed a plan that was as methodical as it was monstrous. They would kill all 6 children. Afterward, Sarah would take her own life. Brandon would then discover the bodies and raise the alarm, playing the role of the shocked relative who arrived too late. It would look like a murder-suicide committed by a desperate mother overwhelmed by her circumstances. Brandon would be free, the secret would die with Sarah and the children, and no one would know the truth. The conspiracy to murder the children was calculated to take place between May 14th and May 20th, according to the charges later filed against them. But the actual implementation of their horrific plan would begin on the evening of May 23rd. As the sun set on May 23rd, 2019, the 4 oldest children in the Barris household, including Blake and Tristan, were gathered together by their mother. Sarah had spent the day collecting tablets from around the house, prescription medications, over-the-counter pills, anything that could be harmful if consumed in quantity. She divided these medications among the 4 children, instructing them to take the pills. The children did not want to take the tablets. They questioned their mother, confused and frightened. But Sarah insisted, her authority as their mother overriding their instincts for self-preservation. One by one, reluctantly, the children swallowed the medications they had been given. Sarah and Brandon expected the overdose to kill the children overnight while they slept. To cover her tracks, Sarah engaged in a performance of normalcy that adds another layer of horror to the story. She sent messages to friends claiming that the household had been struck by a stomach bug, explaining away any future symptoms or absence from school. She posted on social media about the family illness, casually informing her online network that the children were unwell. Anyone reading those messages would have seen a concerned mother dealing with a common childhood ailment. No one could have imagined that she had just forced her children to ingest potentially lethal doses of medication. But the plan failed. The tablets did not kill the children. Instead, the 4 oldest children became violently ill. They vomited, hallucinated, and suffered through the night, their small bodies fighting to expel the poisons their mother had forced into them. Sarah and Brandon watched and waited, but as dawn approached, it became clear that the overdose had not achieved its intended purpose. Rather than recognizing this as a sign to stop, to seek help, to acknowledge the magnitude of what they were doing, Sarah Barris doubled down. If the tablets would not kill the children, she would find another way. She turned to the internet, searching for alternative methods of murder. Her search history would later reveal the chilling keywords: suffocation, strangulation, drowning. She was methodically researching how to kill her own children. At some point during this terrible night, as her children lay sick and frightened, Sarah reportedly made a statement that would later haunt everyone who heard it. "I gave them life, I can take it away." It was the ultimate assertion of ownership, a claim that her children were hers to dispose of as she saw fit. It revealed a fundamental corruption in her understanding of what it meant to be a mother. May 24th, 2019, brought no relief for the Barris children. Still suffering from the effects of the forced overdose, they woke to a household that must have felt increasingly surreal and terrifying. Sarah and Brandon were now actively implementing their backup plan. The couple had decided which children to kill first. Blake, 14 years old, and Tristan, 13, were the oldest and perhaps the most likely to resist or escape. They would be the primary targets. Sarah called Brandon to the house to help her complete what the tablets had failed to accomplish. What happened next is almost unbearable to recount, but it must be told to honor the memory of Blake and Tristan and to understand the full scope of the crime. According to court testimony, Sarah strangled Tristan herself. She wrapped the cord from her dressing gown around his neck and pulled with all her strength for approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes is an eternity when you are killing your own child, when you are watching the life drain from eyes that look like yours, when you are feeling a body go limp in your hands. During those 3 minutes, Sarah had countless opportunities to stop, to recognize the horror of what she was doing, to choose life over death. She did not stop. Brandon Mackin strangled Blake with his bare hands. The father murdered his son through direct physical force, feeling the boy's struggle, his desperate attempts to breathe, his body's final convulsions. When the strangulation was complete, the couple did not leave the bodies to be discovered. They placed plastic bin bags over the heads of both boys, ensuring their certain death, eliminating any possibility that somehow the children might survive. But even with 2 children dead, Sarah and Brandon's murderous plan was not finished. They turned their attention to the younger children. One of the younger siblings was dragged to the bathroom, where Sarah and Brandon repeatedly attempted to drown the child in the bathtub. The child fought, struggled, and somehow survived the attempts on their life. It was during these final moments of horror that salvation arrived in an unexpected form. Sarah had been messaging a friend throughout this period, and something in those messages, perhaps a tone, perhaps a specific phrase, perhaps the friend's own instinct that something was terribly wrong, prompted the friend to contact police. Emergency services were dispatched to Gregg House Road. When police arrived at approximately 7:45 p.m., they interrupted the murders in progress. The scene that greeted them was one of absolute chaos and tragedy. Blake and Tristan were beyond help, their bodies already cooling. The 4 younger children were alive but unconscious, suffering from the combined effects of the drug overdose and the physical trauma of the attacks. Sarah Barris and Brandon Mackin were arrested at the scene. The murder investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Forensic teams examined every inch of the semi-detached council house on Gregg House Road, documenting the evidence of what had transpired. The garden, described by investigators as unkempt, suggested a household that had been struggling even before the murders. Inside, the physical evidence told a story of premeditation and sustained violence. Sarah Barris and Brandon Mackin were charged with 2 counts of murder for the deaths of Blake and Tristan. They were also charged with conspiracy to murder all 6 children and 5 counts of attempted murder related to the 4 surviving children and the 2 attempted murders of Blake and Tristan on May 23rd before their actual deaths on May 24th. The charges reflected the full scope of their plan, not just the murders they had completed, but the murders they had intended to commit. On September 27, 2019, Sarah Barris appeared at Sheffield Crown Court. She sobbed as she pleaded guilty to all charges. Brandon Mackin, standing beside her, also admitted to the same charges. There would be no trial, no drawn-out legal battle, no claims of innocence. Both defendants acknowledged what they had done. During an earlier court appearance, a moment occurred that revealed Sarah's skewed priorities, even in the face of murder charges. She complained to magistrates that they had misspelled the names of her dead sons in the court documents. She could be heard shouting at Brandon McKinn as they were led away from the dock. Even in custody, even after murdering her children, Sarah was concerned with control and correctness in a way that seemed disconnected from the magnitude of her crimes. The sentencing hearing on November 11, 2019, brought the full horror of the case into public view. Judge Jeremy Richardson QC addressed the defendants directly, his words reflecting the shock and revulsion felt by all who had learned of the case. He stated, "No words of mine can ever fully reflect the enormity of what you have both done." The prosecutor, Melly QC, laid out the Crown's case in devastating detail. She explained that while Sarah and Brandon were clearly motivated to prevent the loss of their children to local authority care, this fear was inextricably combined with their terror of authorities discovering their incestuous relationship. The court heard testimony about Sarah's state of mind, her belief that she was somehow justified in taking her children's lives. Mr. Justice Goss, delivering the sentence, noted that Barris believed her love for her children and her fear of separation somehow justified taking not only their lives but her own as well. It was a twisted logic that placed her emotional needs above the fundamental right of her children to exist. Both Sarah Barris and Brandon McKinn were sentenced to life imprisonment. Each was required to serve a minimum term of 35 years before becoming eligible for parole. Given their ages at sentencing, Sarah was 35 and Brandon was 39. These sentences effectively meant they would spend the rest of their productive lives behind bars. In August 2020, more than a year after the murders, the results of the Serious Case Review were published. The review examined the contact between the Barris family and various care agencies, attempting to determine whether the tragedy could have been prevented. The findings were sobering. The review concluded that there was no evidence that any of the social workers or other agencies involved with the family could have predicted the actions taken in May 2019. Sarah Barris had been viewed by authorities as a loving and caring mother who was struggling with challenging circumstances. Her frequent self-referrals to support services and police were interpreted as signs of a responsible parent seeking help, not as red flags indicating deeper dysfunction. However, the review did identify areas where the system had failed the family. Social workers had not initially investigated the paternity of the children thoroughly. There was a lack of resources and significant delays in providing the family with support services that Sarah had requested. When Sarah was working actively with social services on her children's behavioral issues, the referral was closed prematurely, with workers feeling that it was no longer necessary. The social worker had appreciated Sarah's efforts, but had not necessarily done what was needed to help Sarah resolve the underlying issues. Most significantly, no one had questioned Brandon McKinn's role in the family. He was accepted at face value as the supportive half-brother, helpful but not central to the family dynamic. The true nature of his relationship to Sarah and the children remained hidden until it was exposed by the murders. The review found that there had been no realistic way for professionals to uncover this secret, given the level of deception maintained by Sarah and Brandon. The case highlighted the challenges faced by social services in identifying families at risk when the primary caregivers are actively concealing the truth. It raised difficult questions about the balance between supporting struggling families and protecting children from harm. And it demonstrated how quickly a situation can deteriorate when fear and desperation overtake reason and morality. The house on Gregg House Road, where Blake and Tristan Barris took their last breaths, has since been demolished. The physical structure that held so much suffering has been erased from the landscape, though the memory of what happened there remains. The 4 surviving children, whose identities are protected by court order, have been placed in safe environments where they are receiving ongoing support. They survived a parent's attempt to murder them, a trauma that will shape the rest of their life. For those who worked the case, The police officers who first arrived at the scene, the medical professionals who tried to save the children, the prosecutors who had to present the evidence in court, the judge who had to sentence the killers. The Shire Green murders represented one of the most challenging and heartbreaking cases of their careers. The suffering of Blake and Tristan, and the trauma inflicted on their surviving siblings, left an indelible mark on everyone who encountered the case. How does a mother decide to kill her children? How does a father participate in murdering his own sons? These questions defy easy answers because they require us to confront the darkest capabilities of human nature. The Shire Green murders were not crimes of passion, sudden acts of violence committed in a moment of rage or temporary insanity. They were planned, discussed, and executed with a methodical determination that makes them all the more horrifying. Sarah Barris's psychology, as revealed through the investigation and trial, showed a woman consumed by fear and an overwhelming need for control. Her fear of losing her children to social services was real, but it was rooted in the knowledge that her entire life was built on a lie. The incestuous relationship with Brandon was not just illegal and immoral. It represented a fundamental violation of family bonds and social norms. The children born from that relationship were living evidence of her transgression. Rather than face exposure, rather than accept help, rather than allow her children to be placed in care where they might have had a chance at a normal life, Sarah chose death. She made the calculation that it was better for the children to die than to live without her, that her control over them was more important than their right to exist. This kind of possessive love, if it can be called love at all, is a perversion of the parental bond. Brandon Mackin's role is equally disturbing. He was not just Sarah's partner in crime. He was the father of the children he helped murder. His relationship with Sarah had created the very situation they feared would be discovered. Rather than taking responsibility for his actions, rather than facing the consequences of his choices, he helped extinguish the lives that he had helped create. The case also raises questions about the nature of family secrets and the damage they cause. The children grew up not knowing the truth about their parentage, living in a household where fundamental facts about their identity were hidden from them. When Sarah became convinced that the truth would come out, she chose murder over honesty. The web of deception that she and Brandon had spun became a trap from which she saw no escape except through the ultimate violence. Amid all the legal proceedings, the psychological analysis, and the systemic reviews, it is essential to remember Blake and Tristan as individuals. Blake was 14 years old when he died, on the cusp of young adulthood, with all the potential and possibility that age represents. Tristan was 13, still a child in many ways, navigating the challenging transition of adolescence. The boys never had a chance to understand why their mother was doing what she was doing. They died confused, frightened, and betrayed by the person they should have been able to trust most. They died to keep a secret that was not theirs, to protect a lie they had not told. Their deaths accomplished nothing except to add to the sum of human suffering in the world. Blake and Tristan Barris deserved to grow up, to finish school, to fall in love, to make mistakes and learn from them, to pursue dreams and build futures. They deserved parents who would nurture them, protect them, and put their needs above all else. Instead, they got parents who decided that the children's lives were less important than keeping a secret. The 4 surviving siblings carry forward the memory of their brothers, along with their own trauma from that terrible May weekend. They will grow up knowing that their parents tried to kill them all, that Blake and Tristan were not as fortunate as they were. That knowledge will shape their understanding of trust, safety, and family in ways that no amount of therapy or support can fully resolve. The Shire Green murders stand as a reminder of the vulnerability of children, even within their own homes. They demonstrate that the greatest danger to a child often comes not from strangers, but from those closest to them. And they illustrate the tragic consequences when secrets, fear, and selfishness override the most basic human instinct to protect one's young. In the years since May 2019, the community of Shire Green has worked to heal and move forward. But the names Blake Barris and Tristan Barris remain etched in memory. 2 boys whose lives were stolen by those who should have loved them most, two young souls who deserved so much more than they received. Their story is a tragedy in the truest sense, a reminder that even in modern Britain, with all our social services and safeguards, children can still fall through the cracks and into darkness. The best we can do now is remember them, learn from their deaths, and work to ensure that no other children suffer the same fate. Story 2. The fluorescent lights of the bowling alley cast their familiar glow across the polished lanes as Eric Miller settled into a booth with a group of colleagues on that November evening in 2000. At 30 years old, Eric embodied the promise of dedicated scientific research, a brilliant mind committed to finding solutions for children suffering from AIDS. His work at the University of North Carolina's Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center had earned him respect among peers and hope from families touched by the devastating disease. With his athletic build, warm smile, and genuine kindness, Eric seemed untouchable by the darker forces that sometimes lurk beneath the surface of ordinary lives. The bowling alley gathering was meant to be casual, a chance for Miller's co-workers from GlaxoSmithKline to unwind after long days in the laboratory. Eric had joined the group at his wife's encouragement, a gesture meant to ease any concerns he might have about her spending time with male colleagues. Among them was Darrell Willard, a 37-year-old biochemist who had become increasingly present in Anne's professional and personal world. When Darrell ordered a pitcher of beer and distributed cups around the table, no one thought anything of the ordinary gesture. But when Eric took his first sip, his face twisted with confusion. "This beer tastes kind of funky," he remarked, his words casual but edged with concern. Something was wrong with the bitter liquid, something his trained scientific mind couldn't quite identify. Within an hour, Eric's body began to rebel against itself. Violent waves of nausea overcame him, and his skin grew pale and clammy. His friends watched in growing alarm as the healthy young researcher doubled over in pain, his body racked with symptoms that seemed far too severe for simple food poisoning, and rushed her husband to the hospital that night, her face etched with what appeared to be genuine worry. The emergency room doctors ran their standard battery of tests, searching for answers to explain Eric's sudden and dramatic illness. His symptoms mirrored those of a severe flu, fever, vomiting, weakness that seemed to drain the strength from his very bones. For more than a week, Eric remained hospitalized while physicians puzzled over his condition. They found nothing definitively wrong, no clear pathogen or obvious cause. Gradually, his symptoms subsided, and on November 24th, Eric was released to recover at home, though he was so weakened he needed a cane to walk. His parents, Virus and Doris Miller, had traveled from their home in Indiana to be by their son's side. They had raised Eric in rural Indiana, watching him grow from a mischievous boy who hid behind the couch when his sisters had boyfriends over into a compassionate scientist driven by a desire to heal the world's most vulnerable. Their pride in him was boundless, especially after the birth of his daughter Claire in January 2000. Eric had looked into his mother's eyes and told her something she would never forget. "Mom, you always told me how much you loved me, but I never knew how much you loved me until I had Claire." The Miller family tried to remain optimistic as Eric recuperated at home. His sisters, Pam and Leanne, took turns checking on him, while Anne appeared devoted to his care. But on November 30th, just 6 days after his hospital discharge, Eric's body betrayed him once more. After eating a chicken dinner that Anne had prepared, he became violently ill again, his condition deteriorating with terrifying speed. Back in the hospital, Eric began hallucinating, his mind fragmenting under the assault of toxins his doctors still couldn't identify. His sister Leanne remembers physically laying across his thrashing body, her face close to his, pleading with him to calm down as he cried out in confusion and fear. Finally, the laboratory results arrived with devastating clarity. Eric's blood contained high levels of arsenic, a poison so sinister it had been mimicking flu symptoms while systematically destroying his organs. The medical team immediately contacted the Raleigh Police Department, but by the time Detective Deborah Regenton arrived at the hospital on December 2nd, Eric Miller's heart had already stopped beating. He died surrounded by medical equipment and the shattered hopes of everyone who loved him. Minutes after Eric's death, Virus and Doris stood in the hospital room, staring at their son's still form. A breathing tube remained in his mouth from the failed resuscitation attempt, and his body had already begun to grow cold. Doris wanted desperately to remove that tube, to cover her son and warm him, to somehow undo the impossible reality before her. But Eric was gone, taken by a poison that had been administered deliberately, methodically, over months of calculated cruelty. Lieutenant Chris Morgan of the Raleigh Police Department took charge of the investigation, with the understanding that Eric Miller's death was no accident. Medical examiner Dr. Tom Clark confirmed what Morgan had suspected. The levels of arsenic in Eric's system were far too high for accidental exposure. Someone had poisoned Eric intentionally, someone who had access to both arsenic and the victim himself, someone who understood that arsenic poisoning could masquerade as common illness. Morgan's first thought turned to Eric's workplace. The young researcher worked in a laboratory environment where chemicals were commonplace, and competitive professional jealousy could potentially drive someone to terrible acts. But as Detective Regenton combed through the Miller home, collecting samples of every liquid, every soap, every potential source of contamination, a different picture began to emerge. Police found no arsenic in Eric's laboratory at UNC. No jealous colleagues emerged from the investigation. Instead, the evidence began pointing in a direction that Eric's family found almost impossible to accept, and Miller appeared devastated by her husband's death. At his funeral, she collapsed in the arms of friends, her body shaking with sobs as she cried out, "Why? Why did Eric have to die?" Eric's sisters and parents saw a young widow destroyed by grief, a woman who had lost the love of her life. They defended her when police began asking uncomfortable questions, unable to imagine that the beautiful blonde chemist who had seemed so perfect for Eric could harbor such darkness. The couple's love story had begun in a Purdue University biology class, where chemistry of a different sort had sparked between them. And Breyer, the eldest of 3 daughters from an upper-middle-class Pennsylvania family, was everything Eric's family had hoped for: intelligent, ambitious, attractive, and devoted. She seemed to share Eric's passion for science and his dreams for the future. When Eric proposed on Valentine's Day, Anne's college roommate remembered it as the happiest time of her life, a moment when she was marrying the man of her dreams. After graduating in 1992, Eric and Anne moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, both accepted into graduate programs at North Carolina State University. Their life together appeared idyllic on the surface: a beautiful home, successful careers, and the arrival of baby Claire. But beneath the veneer of perfection, darker currents had begun to flow. Eric had chosen to pursue a federal grant for pediatric AIDS research rather than accepting a high-paying pharmaceutical position, a decision that left the family living on a modest researcher's salary, web content. For Anne, who had developed expensive tastes and a keen attention to material possessions, this sacrifice became increasingly difficult to accept, and abandoned her PhD studies to take a lucrative position at GlaxoSmithKline, the British pharmaceutical giant with a major research facility in Research Triangle Park. With her new income, she indulged in cosmetic surgery, a breast augmentation that represented her growing fixation on outward appearance and the finer things in life. Her sister-in-law Leanne would later recall, her outer appearance was very important to her: how she dressed, her makeup, her hair, everything down to her fingernails and toenails. It was at GlaxoSmithKline that Anne met Darrell Willard, a married father who worked alongside her in the laboratory. They began as colleagues, but their relationship evolved into something more intimate. Phone records revealed the depth of their connection. Multiple calls each day, sometimes at 4:30 in the morning, far beyond the boundaries of professional acquaintance. Just days before Eric's first illness at the bowling alley, Anne and Darrell had traveled to Chicago together, checking into the Ritz-Carlton for a weekend of room service and romance under the guise of a business trip that never existed. The emails police recovered from Anne's computer painted a picture of passionate obsession. "I never want to stop making you feel. and had written to Daryl. Hours after sending that message, Daryl had poured Eric the bitter-tasting beer at the bowling alley, the beer that would send Eric to the hospital for the first time. But the autopsy revealed something even more disturbing. Dr. Tom Clark's examination found arsenic in Eric's hair dating back 4 months before the bowling alley incident, months before investigators believed and in Daryl's affair had even begun. Someone had been administering small doses of poison to Eric long before that November night. Someone who had constant access to him. Someone who could slip the toxin into his food or drink without arousing suspicion. That someone could only be Anne. Morgan became convinced that, and had been experimenting on her own husband, testing how much arsenic it would take to make him sick, learning the poison's effects through cruel trial. And when she was ready to eliminate Eric entirely, Morgan believed, she had turned to Daryl Willard as an accomplice and potential scapegoat. If anything went wrong, Daryl could take the fall while and maintained her carefully constructed image of the grieving widow. When police finally confronted Anne about her affair, arriving at her home on what should have been Claire's first birthday celebration, she fled upstairs and hid in a closet. The Miller family, who had traveled from Indiana for the occasion, stood in shocked disbelief as investigators revealed the depth of Anne's betrayal. Virus Miller felt a dagger in his heart, learning that Anne had spoken with Daryl Willard for 24 minutes, just 2 hours before Eric died. The pieces were falling into place in the most painful way imaginable. That same day, 9 miles across Raleigh, Lieutenant Morgan stood on Daryl Willard's doorstep. The biochemist who answered the door looked like a man experiencing total defeat, his face marked by resignation and despair. Morgan confronted him directly, suggesting that Anne had used him, manipulated him into her deadly scheme. Daryl looked up and said words that haunted Morgan. "Yeah, and she's done a very good job of it." But before Morgan could press further, Daryl invoked his right to speak with an attorney, cutting off the conversation just as it was getting somewhere. 24 hours later, Daryl Willard was dead. His wife Yvette found him in their garage, a suicide note beside his lifeless body. "I have been accused of an action for which I am not responsible," he had written. "I have taken no one's life save my own." The note spoke of a world that looked black, of public humiliation and economic ruin, of a man who could no longer cope with the accusations and the exposure of his affair. Yvette had known about her husband's attraction to Anne, had recognized the way he talked about her differently than other co-workers. She had even known about the Chicago trip, allowing her husband to leave on her birthday without confrontation, hoping he would come to his senses. Now he was gone, and she blamed Anne Miller entirely for his death. Daryl, she insisted, was not capable of murder. He had been seduced and manipulated by a woman far more dangerous than anyone realized. With Daryl's death, Morgan lost his key witness and potential accomplice testimony. The case against Anne seemed to stall despite mounting circumstantial evidence. She had access to arsenic compounds at her GlaxoSmithKline laboratory, specifically sodium cacodylate, the same type found in Eric's body. She had exclusive access to Eric during the months of poisoning. She had motive in the form of her affair with Daryl and her dissatisfaction with their modest lifestyle. But without direct evidence placing the poison in her hands, the district attorney was reluctant to prosecute, and hired 2 of North Carolina's most prominent defense attorneys, Wade Smith and Joe Cheshire, lawyers who would later successfully defend the Duke lacrosse players. She refused to speak with investigators, exercising her legal rights while the Miller family struggled to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster the evidence suggested. More disturbing details emerged as the investigation continued. While Eric lay dying in the hospital and had been conducting a romantic relationship with a man in California in addition to her affair with Daryl. On the day Eric was transferred to the intensive care unit and chose to spend her time at the beauty salon, telling the hairdresser she was ready for something new, something fresh. She had thrown away Eric's soiled clothing and bathroom rugs from his first illness, disposing of potential evidence under the guise of stress-driven cleaning. Against the wishes of Eric's family, who wanted to bury their son in Indiana, and insisted that Eric be cremated. She pleaded with them, claiming she wanted his ashes interred at a Catholic church in Raleigh, so she and Claire could visit every Sunday. The Millers, their hearts breaking, agreed to respect what they believed were their daughter-in-law's genuine wishes. But just weeks later, and moved 120 miles away to Wilmington, abandoning Eric's ashes and starting a new life. In Wilmington, and reinvented herself completely. She took a job with an interior designer, far from the scientific world where her crimes had been committed. She began dating Paul Kantz, a Christian rock musician who knew nothing of her dark past. To Lieutenant Morgan, who had devoted himself to securing justice for Eric Miller, Anne's behavior confirmed his belief that she was a psychopath incapable of genuine remorse or guilt. Forensic psychologist Michael Teague went undercover to observe Anne at her new workplace, hoping to gain insight into her psychological profile. What he saw disturbed him deeply, and projected an image of meekness and harmlessness, a chameleon-like ability to transform herself and manipulate perceptions. She didn't fit the typical profile of a husband killer. She was highly educated, from a wealthy background, seemingly lacking the desperation or mental illness that usually drove such crimes. But Teague concluded that Anne was very disturbed, very high risk, a woman without boundaries who had murdered a saint like Eric Miller and might kill again. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. Years into the investigation, Morgan reread the case files and noticed something crucial in a transcript of an interview with Yvette Willard. She had mentioned that before his suicide, Daryl's attorney, Rick Gammon, had warned him he could be charged with attempted murder. Morgan realized that Daryl must have told Gammon something incriminating about Anne's role in Eric's death. The attorney-client privilege that protected those communications became the focus of a legal battle that would last for years. District Attorney Cologne Willoughby took on the monumental task of breaking one of the most sacred privileges in law. The case worked its way through the court system while Anne married Paul Kantz in November 2003, 3 years after Eric's murder. Morgan approached retirement age, his career consumed by the pursuit of justice for a man he had never met in life, but had come to know intimately through the investigation of his death. In spring 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court made its landmark decision, ruling that Gammon must reveal what Daryl Willard had told him. The attorney's testimony was devastating. Daryl had told Gammon that he met Anne in a parking lot while Eric was hospitalized, and had been crying, and she confessed to injecting a substance from a syringe into Eric's while alone in his hospital room. When Daryl asked why she had done it, Anne simply replied, I don't know why I did it." The revelation put the murder weapon directly in Anne's hands and confirmed what the medical examiner had suspected. Eric had received at least one fatal dose of arsenic while in the hospital, administered by the one person he should have been able to trust completely. Daryl's posthumous testimony also vindicated him. He had told his attorney he never tried to kill Eric, that he had been manipulated by and rather than an active participant in murder. On September 27, 2004, a grand jury indicted Anne Miller Kantz for the murder of Eric Miller. She turned herself in to Raleigh police, her bail set at $3 million. But as her trial date approached in January 2006, and made a calculated decision. Rather than face a jury and risk a first-degree murder conviction that could mean life in prison or even the death penalty, she accepted a plea deal. On November 8, 2005, nearly 5 years after Eric's death, Anne stood in court and spoke words the Miller family had waited so long to hear. In a small, barely audible voice, she pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The judge asked her directly, "Miss Kantz, did you with malice unlawfully and intentionally participate in causing the death of Eric Miller?" Her answer was simple and damning, "Yes, sir." The plea agreement sentenced Anne to between 25 and 31 and a half years in prison, the maximum allowed for someone with no prior convictions. In a statement read by her attorneys, she claimed, "I will struggle for the rest of my life with how this could have happened, and I have asked God to forgive me." But to the Miller family, her words rang hollow. Veris Miller spoke for them all. She wants forgiveness. Where's the forgiveness been for the last 5 years? She's sorry she got caught. Eric's sisters confronted and in court, their emotions raw and unfiltered after years of waiting for justice. Pam demanded to know why and wouldn't look at her, why she had brutally murdered her brother by poisoning him and watching him suffer. Leanne spoke of the precious gift and had stolen from Claire, the chance to know her father. She asked the question that haunted them all. Why didn't you just divorce him? Lieutenant Morgan had his own theory. In Anne's world, divorce meant admitting imperfection, shattering the image of the ideal couple that she had worked so carefully to maintain. By murdering Eric, she could cast herself as the tragic victim, the young widow deserving of sympathy, rather than a failed wife facing judgment for her choices. From her perspective, murder was preferable to the humiliation of acknowledged failure. When Morgan retired from the Raleigh Police Department after Anne's sentencing, he felt no satisfaction in the resolution of the case that had consumed 5 years of his life. What in the hell have I got to be happy about? He reflected. 2 good men are dead. 2 little girls will never know their fathers. Justice had been served, but it came at a cost that could never truly be measured. A judge ruled that and could not see her daughter Claire, who went to live with Anne's sister while Eric's family shared custody. The little girl who had been just 10 months old when her father died would grow up knowing him only through photographs and the stories of those who loved him. And Miller Kantz remains incarcerated at the Noose Correctional Institution in Goldsboro, North Carolina. Her earliest projected release date is September 2029, when she will be 59 years old. The death of Eric Miller remains a tragedy that reverberates through multiple families, a stark reminder that evil can wear a beautiful face and hide behind the trappings of normalcy. A dedicated scientist who devoted his life to healing children never got to see his own daughter grow up. A man who trusted his wife with his very life became the victim of her calculated cruelty. And in the end, the question that haunts everyone who knew Eric remains unanswered. How could someone who claimed to love him watch him suffer and die, not once showing mercy or remorse until the weight of evidence left her no choice but to confess? The case serves as a sobering testament to the reality that monsters are not always strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes they share your home, your bed, your dreams for the future. Sometimes they are the person you trust most in the world, and by the time you realize the truth, it is already too late. Story 3. The autumn evening of October 20th, 2024, began like any other for Rhiannon Sky White. At 27 years old, she had spent the last 3 months working at the Park Inn by Radisson Hotel in Walsall, England, a facility converted to temporarily house asylum seekers. Her responsibilities included cleaning rooms and serving food to the residents, tasks she approached with the same warmth and dedication that defined her character. She was a mother to a 5-year-old son who meant everything to her, and despite the challenges of single parenthood, Rhiannon remained steadfast in her commitment to providing for her family. As the clock approached 11 that night, she clocked out from her shift, tired but looking forward to returning home. The hotel had become a temporary residence for dozens of asylum seekers, individuals who had fled their homelands seeking safety and refuge in Britain. Among them was Deng Kol Majek, a Sudanese national who claimed to be 19 years old, though prosecutors would later estimate he was likely in his mid-20s. Majek had been staying at the hotel for some time, one face among many that Rhiannon encountered during her shifts. She had no personal relationship with him beyond the professional courtesy she extended to all residents. She could not have known that on this particular night, for reasons that would never be fully understood, Majek had singled her out. Inside the hotel's reception area, security cameras captured Majek lingering near the front desk throughout Rhiannon's evening shift. The footage revealed a disturbing pattern. He was watching her, his eyes following her movements as she went about her duties. There was an intensity to his surveillance, a fixation that should have raised alarms, but went unnoticed in the mundane rhythm of the hotel's operations. Rhiannon remained oblivious to the danger brewing in the same space where she worked to help others. She had no reason to suspect that anyone would wish her harm. She was simply doing her job, offering assistance and kindness to people who had lost nearly everything. When Rhiannon's shift ended shortly before 11, she gathered her belongings and stepped out into the cool October night. Her destination was Bescott Stadium Railway Station, a short walk from the hotel, where she would catch a train for home. As she made her way along the familiar route, she pulled out her phone and called her friend Emma Cowley. The two women chatted easily, their conversation flowing with the comfortable intimacy of long friendship. Rhiannon had no idea that behind her, Majek had slipped out of the hotel and was following her into the darkness. Security footage from various points along the route captured the sinister reality Rhiannon could not perceive. Majek trailed behind her, deliberately closing the distance between them with each step. He moved with purpose, a predator stalking prey, armed with a screwdriver he had concealed on his person. The weapon was crude but deadly, a tool transformed into an instrument of violence. As Rhiannon entered Bescott Stadium Station and made her way to the platform, Majek continued to follow. The station was deserted at that late hour, the platforms empty and silent save for the sound of Rhiannon's voice as she continued her phone conversation with Emma. On the other end of the line, Emma Cowley listened as her friend spoke, the conversation ordinary and unremarkable until suddenly it was not. The change was abrupt and terrifying. Emma later testified that what had been a normal chat transformed in an instant into something nightmarish. "At first, I didn't hear anything, then I heard a scream," Emma recalled. It was a high-pitched, terrified, high-pitched scream. The sound pierced through the phone line with a clarity that would haunt Emma forever. She called out to Rhiannon, desperation rising in her voice, but received no response. The line remained open, transmitting sounds that defied comprehension before falling silent. On the empty platform, Majek had launched his attack with sudden and overwhelming violence. Rhiannon had no opportunity to defend herself, no chance to flee. Cornered and defenseless, she endured a brutal assault that lasted only moments but inflicted catastrophic damage. Majek stabbed her 23 times with the screwdriver, 11 of the wounds penetrating her skull, while others struck her chest and left arm. The ferocity of the attack was staggering, each blow delivered with a force that spoke to rage beyond reason or understanding. Rhiannon collapsed onto the platform, her life bleeding away onto the cold concrete. Having completed his savage work, Majek fled the scene. Security cameras captured him running from the station, clutching Rhiannon's mobile phone, which he would later discard by throwing it into a river. The murder weapon, the screwdriver that had become an instrument of death, was also disposed of and never recovered by investigators. Majek made his way back to the hotel, his distinctive clothing now stained with Rhiannon's blood, visible evidence of the violence he had perpetrated. What happened next would shock investigators and prosecutors alike. Approximately an hour after the murder, hotel security cameras captured Majek in the parking lot, dancing and drinking, his demeanor one of apparent celebration. The footage depicted a man seemingly unburdened by the horror he had just inflicted, exhibiting behavior that prosecutors would later describe as utterly heartless. While Rhiannon lay dying in a hospital bed, Majek appeared entirely unconcerned, even jubilant. The stark contrast between his actions and their consequences painted a portrait of callousness that defied comprehension. Emergency services had responded to the scene after Emma Cowley, still on the phone line, alerted authorities that something terrible had happened. Paramedics found Rhiannon unconscious on the platform, her injuries so severe that she never regained consciousness. She was rushed to the hospital where medical staff fought desperately to save her life, but the damage was too extensive. On October 23, 2024, 3 days after the attack, Rhiannon Sky White died, leaving behind a young son who would grow up without his mother. The investigation that followed was meticulous and comprehensive. British Transport Police, working closely with the Crown Prosecution Service, constructed a timeline of events using multiple strands of evidence. Security footage from the hotel showed Majek watching Rhiannon throughout her shift. Footage from the street showed him following her to the station, and footage from the station confirmed he was the only person to enter and exit the platform during the time of the attack. Although the stabbing itself had not been captured on camera, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Forensic analysis provided damning physical evidence. Majek's clothing, including his jacket, ring, and sandals, were found to contain Rhiannon's blood. More significantly, DNA recovered from beneath Majek's fingernails matched Rhiannon's DNA profile. The evidence formed an unbreakable chain linking Majek to the crime, each piece reinforcing the next to create a picture of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. When Majek was arrested and charged with murder and possession of an offensive weapon, he maintained his innocence with a persistence that bordered on the absurd. Throughout his trial at Wolverhampton Crown Court, which began on October 13, 2025, Majek repeatedly insisted that the evidence against him was wrong. He claimed the person captured on security footage was not him, despite the images clearly showing his distinctive build and clothing. He asserted that the DNA evidence was incorrect, that the blood on his clothes was not Rhiannon's, that the DNA under his fingernails had been misidentified. His denials grew increasingly implausible as the prosecution presented each piece of evidence. Yet he never wavered, never offered an alternative explanation, never expressed remorse. The question that haunted the investigation, the trial, and ultimately the verdict was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire case. Why? What had motivated Majek to target Rhiannon, to follow her into the night and murder her with such savage intensity? Detective Chief Inspector Paul Atwell of British Transport Police acknowledged that the motive behind Majek's decision to launch his brutal attack would likely never be fully understood. There was no evidence of any prior relationship between them, no history of conflict or disagreement. Rhiannon had simply been at work, helping others as she always did, when Majek selected her for reasons known only to him. Throughout the trial, Rhiannon's family sat in the courtroom, enduring the painful process of hearing every detail of her final moments. Her sister Alexandra, who had taken on the care of Rhiannon's young son, struggled to comprehend how such senseless violence could be visited upon someone who had dedicated herself to helping others. In a statement delivered outside the courtroom, Alexandra articulated the anguish that consumed the family. Den Cole Majek stalked, hunted, and then attacked our defenseless Rhiannon, cornering her and launching a brutal assault. But for what reason? The question hung in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. On October 24th, 2025, after hearing all the evidence and deliberating on the facts, the jury delivered their verdict: guilty of murder and possession of an offensive weapon. The conviction brought a measure of justice, but no sense of closure. Rhiannon was still gone, her son still motherless, her family still shattered. Carla Harris, senior Crown prosecutor for CPS West Midlands, acknowledged the limitations of the justice system. Although nothing can bring Rhiannon back, I hope these convictions provide some sense of justice to her family and friends. Before sentencing could proceed, an unexpected complication arose. Majek had claimed to be 19 years old at the time of the murder, asserting he was born around January 2006. However, prosecutors believed he was actually in his mid-20s, making him significantly older than he claimed. The discrepancy was significant because age would influence sentencing parameters under British law. Judge Mr. Justice Sewell requested an age assessment report to determine Majek's actual age before imposing sentence. The sentencing hearing was eventually held on January 30th, 2026. After considering all factors, including the age assessment and the nature of the crime, Judge Sewell sentenced Majek to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years before he would be eligible for parole. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime, the calculated nature of the attack, and the complete absence of remorse Majek had displayed throughout the proceedings. He had shown no emotion during the trial, appearing entirely unconcerned and even bored, much to the distress of Rhiannon's family. For Alexandra White and the rest of Rhiannon's family, the sentence marked the end of a legal process, but not the end of their suffering. Alexandra now faced the responsibility of raising her nephew. explaining to him as he grew older why his mother would never return, helping him navigate a world without the woman who had loved him most. The family described their anguish as endless, a life sentence of their own imposed by a man whose motives remained shrouded in mystery. The broader community struggled to make sense of the tragedy. Rhiannon's death sparked difficult conversations about safety, about the challenges of providing security in public spaces, about the obligations owed to both asylum seekers and the communities that host them. Rhiannon's family, despite their profound grief, urged the public not to judge all asylum seekers based on Majek's actions. They recognized that one individual's depravity should not condemn an entire population of vulnerable people seeking refuge and safety. Detective Chief Inspector Atwell characterized the murder as a vicious, cowardly, and unprovoked assault on a vibrant and selfless young woman who had her whole life ahead of her. The description captured the essential tragedy. Rhiannon had been engaged in the simple act of going home after a day spent helping others when violence found her. She had done nothing to provoke the attack, nothing to deserve the fate that befell her on that darkened railway platform. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter, a friend, a woman whose kindness extended to strangers who needed assistance. And she was murdered for reasons no one, perhaps not even her killer, could adequately explain. Judge Sewell, in addressing Rhiannon's family at the conclusion of the trial, commended the quiet dignity they had displayed throughout the challenging proceedings. "It is unimaginable, and I commend you for it," he remarked, acknowledging the strength required to sit through testimony describing their loved one's final terrifying moments. Their presence throughout the trial served as a testament to Rhiannon's memory, ensuring that she was represented not merely as a victim, but as a whole person whose life had value, meaning, and love. The empty platform at Bescott Stadium Station stands as a stark reminder of what was lost on October 20th, 2024. Passengers waiting for trains now stand where Rhiannon fell, most unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there. But for those who knew and loved her, the location will forever be marked by her absence. The case remains one of those inexplicable tragedies where senseless violence steals a life that held so much promise, leaving behind questions that will never be answered and a void that can never be filled. Rhiannon Sky White should have been able to go to work and come home safely. It was a reasonable expectation, a fundamental right that should be guaranteed to every person. Instead, she became the victim of a predator whose actions defied explanation, whose violence served no purpose beyond destruction. Her story is a reminder of the fragility of safety, the randomness of violence, and the enduring impact of loss. While Deng Cole Majek will spend decades behind bars, Rhiannon's son will grow up without his mother. Her family will carry their grief forward into every tomorrow, and a community will remember the young woman who died simply for being in the wrong place when evil decided to act. Story 4. The sun warmed the coastal town of Torremolinos on the morning of July 7th, 2014, as it always did during the Spanish summer. This popular resort destination on the Costa del Sol attracted tourists from across Europe, drawn by its beaches, vibrant nightlife, and promise of Mediterranean escape. Among those who had come seeking a new life was Sabora Gagani, a 22-year-old woman of Albanian descent who held Italian citizenship. She had arrived 3 years earlier with her boyfriend, Marco, an Italian man from the town of Nettuno, settling into an attic apartment in the El Calvario neighborhood, where they built what appeared from the outside to be a shared existence. But appearances, as they so often do, concealed a darker truth. By the summer of 2014, Sabora had made a decision that would determine the course of her fate. She wanted to end her relationship with Marco. At 22, she was still discovering who she was and what she wanted from life. Working as a bartender in the tourist town, she encountered people from all walks of life, each interaction a reminder that the world held possibilities beyond the confines of her troubled relationship. The decision to leave Marco was not made lightly, but once made, it became the axis around which everything else would turn. Sabora maintained regular contact with her family back in Nettuno, Italy. Her mother, who had raised her with love and hope for her future, waited for her daughter's calls and messages with the anticipation that only a parent can know. Their conversations ranged across the ordinary topics of daily life, but in late June 2014, Sabora shared news that filled her mother with joy. She was planning to get married. The announcement seemed to herald a new chapter, a milestone that suggested stability and happiness ahead. Her mother could not have imagined that within weeks, her daughter's voice would fall silent forever. The change came with shocking suddenness. After announcing her marriage plans, Sabora simply stopped communicating. Her Facebook profile, which had been a window into her life for friends and family across borders, was deleted. Her phone number, which her mother had called countless times with the ease of maternal habit, was blocked. It was as though Sabora had been erased from the digital world, her presence scrubbed clean from every platform that connected her to the people who loved her. For a mother who had spoken to her daughter regularly, the silence was deafening, the absence incomprehensible. On July 14, 2014, exactly 1 week after Sabora's last known communication, her mother received a phone call that offered an explanation, even as it deepened her dread. The caller was Marco, Sabora's former boyfriend, the man from whom she had been trying to separate her life. His voice carried a story that was meant to provide closure, but instead planted seeds of suspicion that would take years to bear fruit. Marco told Sabora's mother that he and Sabora had argued, a dispute whose details he left vague, but whose consequences he made explicit. Sabora had left, walking out of their shared apartment without taking any of her belongings. She had simply gone, he explained, her destination unknown, her intentions mysterious. For a mother who knew her daughter's heart, the story made no sense. Why would Sabora leave without her possessions? Why would she cut off contact so completely, so abruptly, without a word of explanation to the family who cherished her? The questions multiplied with each passing day, each unanswered call, each message sent into the void. Yet without evidence of foul play, without a body or clear indication of harm, the investigation into Sabora's disappearance could only go so far. In 2015, Spanish police issued a public appeal for information, and the organization SOS Desaparecidos distributed Sabora's photograph across the region in hopes that someone, somewhere, had seen her. The search yielded nothing. Sabora Gagani had vanished as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed her whole. Years passed. The case grew cold. Investigators moved on to newer disappearances, fresher leads, cases where hope of resolution still flickered. Sabora's family in Italy lived with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing, the torment of imagining her alive somewhere, unreachable, or worse. Her mother never stopped believing that Marco knew more than he had told them, never stopped suspecting that his story of an argument and an impulsive departure was a carefully constructed lie. But suspicion without evidence is merely anguish with nowhere to go. Marco R. continued living in Torremolinos after Sabora's disappearance. He had a history of convictions for gender violence, a pattern of behavior that painted a troubling portrait of his relationships with women. In the years following Sabora's vanishing, he entered into a new relationship with a woman named Paula, a 28-year-old with whom he eventually had a child. The relationship followed a familiar trajectory, one marked by volatility and control, the hallmarks of an abusive dynamic that escalated over time. On May 17, 2023, nearly 9 years after Sabora Gagani disappeared, neighbors in another Torremolinos residence heard the sounds of a violent argument erupting from Paula's home. The shouting grew louder, more desperate, until concerned neighbors felt compelled to call the police. Officers arrived to find a scene of horror. Paula lay dead inside her home, stabbed 14 times. The brutality of the attack was shocking even to seasoned investigators accustomed to violence. Marco R. had fled the scene, but through citizen cooperation and police work, he was located and arrested just 6 hours later. What happened next would unlock a mystery that had haunted Sabora's family for nearly a decade. At the police precinct where Marco was being processed for Paula's murder, he saw something on the wall that triggered a confession no one had anticipated. Among the various posters and bulletins typical of any police station was a missing persons flyer bearing Sabora Gagani's photograph, a reminder of the young woman who had vanished without a trace in 2014. Whether guilt, fear of discovery, or some unknowable impulse moved him, Marco spontaneously confessed to officers that he knew where Sabora was. He had killed her, he admitted, and hidden her body in a place where no one would find it. The revelation sent shock waves through the investigation. Marco led police back to the attic apartment in the El Calvario neighborhood, where he and Sabora had lived together in 2014. The apartment had changed hands in the intervening years, occupied by tenants who had no knowledge of the secret concealed within their walls. Marco told investigators that he had used acid to dissolve Sabora's body and then walled it up, sealing her remains behind the very structure of the home they had shared. Finding a body hidden within the walls of an apartment presents unique investigative challenges. The current tenants cooperated fully, allowing police to conduct multiple searches of the property. Officers drilled small holes in various walls, inserting cameras in attempts to locate the remains, but their initial efforts proved fruitless. The apartment kept its secret. It was not until June 6, 2023, that officers succeeded, this time employing an X-ray machine to scan the walls systematically. The technology revealed what the naked eye could not: a wooden crate concealed between two walls, its contents unmistakable. Inside the crate, investigators found human remains wrapped in a bin bag. The body had been mutilated and partially dissolved, subjected to treatment that spoke of a desperate attempt to make a person disappear completely. The remains were transported to the Institute of Legal Medicine for autopsy and identification. Although DNA testing would take time to complete, there was little doubt about the identity. The remains found in the wall of Marco R.'s former apartment belonged to Sabora Gagani, the young woman who had been missing since July 7, 2014. The discovery devastated Sabora's family. For 9 years they had lived with uncertainty, clinging to the diminishing hope that she might still be alive somewhere, that one day the phone would ring and her voice would be on the other end. The confirmation of her death, the knowledge of how she had been killed and hidden, transformed their anguish into a different kind of grief. The mayor of Torremolinos, Margarita del Cid, expressed the community's collective sorrow on social media, writing that she was overwhelmed by the discovery and offering condolences to Sabora's family and friends. The city decreed a day of mourning, acknowledging the young woman who had been denied peace and life, and whose remains had been concealed for nearly a decade. Marco R., now facing charges for 2 murders, would eventually provide his version of events and testimony before the Court of Instruction in Torremolinos. On January 30, 2024, appearing by video conference from the prison in Huelva where he was being held, Marco testified for more than 2 hours. Assisted by his lawyer, and in the presence of prosecutors representing both victims, Marco acknowledged his involvement in Paula's death but denied killing Sabora. His story about Sabora's death was elaborate and shifted blame onto others. According to Marco's testimony, Sabora had borrowed 25,000 euros from Albanian compatriots to start a business. The money was subsequently stolen by Colombians she met during a night out, leaving her unable to repay the debt. Marco claimed that Albanian lenders began pressuring Sabora for repayment, escalating to the point where she planned to flee. He testified that he helped her, allowing her to stay in their apartment despite their ended relationship, and that 4 armed Albanian men appeared demanding payment of the alleged loan. According to his account, these men killed Sabora in front of him using a knife and ordered him to hide the body. He claimed to know the name of one perpetrator, but refused to reveal it. The story was convenient, placing Marco in the role of witness and unwilling accomplice rather than perpetrator. It explained his possession of Sabora's body and his decision to wall it up, while absolving him of direct responsibility for her death. But it contradicted his earlier confession when he was first arrested for Paula's murder, and it strained credulity in multiple respects. If Albanian criminals had indeed killed Sabora, why would they trust Marco to hide the body? Why would he comply with such an order rather than reporting the crime to authorities? Why would he tell Sabora's family that she had simply left after an argument, rather than explaining that she had been murdered by loan sharks? Regarding Paula's murder, Marco's testimony claimed self-defense. He stated that on May 17, 2023, both he and Paula were intoxicated and argued violently. According to his version, Paula threatened him with a knife, he defended himself, and the situation escalated out of control. He admitted killing her, but framed it as an act of self-defense rather than deliberate murder. The claim of self-defense was difficult to reconcile with forensic evidence showing Paula had been stabbed 14 times, suggesting an attack far beyond what would be necessary to defend oneself from an immediate threat. In a handwritten 18-page letter sent from prison to the investigating magistrate on January 1, 2024, Marco expanded on his accounts of both deaths, though he devoted more detail to Paula's case than to Sabora's. In the letter, he claimed to have experienced a spiritual awakening while incarcerated, describing a very strong rapprochement with God, and asserting that he was learning from his mistakes. The religious language suggested remorse, but whether it represented genuine contrition or strategic positioning in advance of trial remained unclear. The legal proceedings against Marco would continue as prosecutors built their cases for both murders. He faced charges not only for the deaths of Sabora Gagani and Paula, but also for the additional crime of concealing Sabora's body for 9 years. His history of prior convictions for gender violence painted a pattern of abusive behavior toward women, strengthening the prosecution's argument that both deaths resulted from his inability to accept the end of romantic relationships. For Sabora's family, particularly her mother, who had spent nearly a decade searching for answers, the truth brought both closure and renewed pain. The knowledge that Sabora had been murdered shortly after deciding to end her relationship with Marco, that she had died in the summer of 2014, rather than living somewhere beyond reach, transformed the nature of their loss. The woman who had deleted Sabora's Facebook profile and blocked her phone number had not been Sabora herself, fleeing to some unknown destination, but almost certainly Marco, covering his tracks by eliminating the digital traces of her existence. The announcement of marriage plans that Sabora had shared with her mother in late June 2014 took on new meaning in hindsight, possibly representing her hope for a future with someone new, a future that Marco had violently extinguished. The case resonated beyond the immediate circle of victims' families, raising broader questions about how society identifies and intervenes in patterns of violence against women. Marco R.'s history of convictions for gender violence had not prevented him from entering new relationships or escalating his behavior to murder. The question of whether more could have been done to protect Paula, whether warning systems or legal restrictions might have prevented her death, haunted those who studied the case. And for Sabora, whose disappearance in 2014 had been investigated but never solved until Marco's confession, there was the painful recognition that she had been there all along, sealed behind a wall in the apartment where she had once lived, as close to discovery as the width of plaster and brick. The seaside town of Torremolinos, with its sunny beaches and cheerful tourism, now bore the shadow of two women who had died there, their lives cut short by the same man's violence. Sabora Gagani, who had come to Spain seeking opportunity and ended up trapped in a relationship she tried to leave, became a symbol of the deadly risk that accompanies domestic violence when victims attempt to break free. Her story was not unique, but it was hers, and in its telling, it demanded recognition of her humanity beyond the circumstances of her death. 9 years is a long time to be hidden. 9 years of seasons changing, of tourists coming and going, of life continuing in the town while Sabora remained concealed in darkness and silence. When Spanish police finally found her remains in June 2023, it marked the end of one mystery and the beginning of a legal process seeking justice. But for her mother, for her family, for everyone who had loved Sabora and wondered where she had gone, the discovery brought an ending that was also an indictment of the violence that had taken her, of the years she had been denied proper rest, of the man who had sealed her away as though she could be erased, forgotten, disappeared as if she had never existed at all. Story 5. The last Friday of May in 2003 arrived with the promise of a perfect summer weekend in Philadelphia. The sun hung low over the Fishtown neighborhood, casting long shadows across the row houses that lined the narrow streets of this working-class enclave in the city's northeast corner. For 16-year-old Jason Keel Sweeney, the day had been like so many others that spring. Long hours on a construction site, working alongside his father Paul, learning the trade that would one day allow him to support himself and perhaps a family of his own. Jason had been born on July 29, 1986, the eldest child of Paul and Dawn Sweeney. He had grown up in Fishtown, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where generations of families had stayed and built lives within blocks of where they were born. The area took its name from the bustling shad fishing industry that had thrived along the Delaware River in the 19th century. By the time Jason was growing up there, the fishing industry had faded, but the river remained, its waters flowing past the eastern edge of the neighborhood, bordered by a wooded area locals simply called the Trails. Jason was a typical teenager in many ways. Freckles still dotted his face, a reminder that childhood was not so far behind him. He had dreams of the future, plans that stretched beyond the confines of Fishtown's familiar streets. But Jason had also made a significant decision that separated him from many of his peers. He had left school to work full-time for his father's construction business. It was honest, hard work that left him exhausted at the end of each day, his hands calloused and often bearing the cuts and scrapes that came with the job. He earned his money, receiving a weekly paycheck of $500 in cash, a substantial sum for a 16-year-old in 2003. While Jason had chosen the path of work and responsibility, many of his friends had gone down a different road. Drug use was common among the teenagers in Fishtown, with marijuana, heroin, and prescription pills like Xanax circulating through the social circles that gathered in parks and on street corners. Jason's parents, particularly his mother Dawn, had noticed changes in some of the boys their son had grown up with. Eddie Batzig had been Jason's best friend since the 4th grade, a friendship spanning more than a decade of shared memories and childhood adventures. But recently, Dawn Sweeney had observed that Eddie had become very rude and inconsiderate, a transformation from the kind child she had once known. Despite these concerns, Jason remained loyal to his old friends. Loyalty and friendship meant something to him, values his parents had instilled. When you grew up with someone, when you shared years of your life with them, you did not simply walk away when things got difficult. This loyalty, this fundamental decency that defined Jason's character, would ultimately lead him into a trap from which there would be no escape. In the final days of May 2003, Jason met someone new, someone who seemed to offer the promise of romance and excitement that every teenage boy craves. Her name was Justina Morley, and she was 15 years old. Jason liked her immediately. She seemed interested in him, flirtatious and attentive in ways that made his heart race. They began what Jason believed was a relationship, and he looked forward to spending time with her, imagining that this might be the beginning of something special. On Friday evening, May 30th, they had plans for a date. Jason finished his work on the construction site, collected his weekly pay of $500 in cash, and prepared to meet Justina. What Jason did not know, could not have known, was that Justina Morley was simultaneously involved in intimate relations with 2 other teenage boys, Nicholas Koya, who was 16, and Edward Batzig Jr., Jason's best friend since childhood. What Jason could not have imagined was that in a kitchen in Fishtown, on that very afternoon while he worked under the sun, for teenagers were finalizing a plot that had been developing for weeks, a plan that had Jason Sweeney at its center and murder as its conclusion. The conspiracy involved Justina Morley, Edward Batzig, and 2 brothers, Nicholas and Dominic Koya. Dominic was 18 years old, while his younger brother Nicholas was 16, the same age as Jason and Eddie. The 4 had gathered in a house where a friend named Joshua Staub was staying, and there, in that kitchen, they refined the details of what would happen that evening. The plan was coldly calculated. Justina would serve as the bait, luring Jason to the trails with the promise of intimacy. The three young men would hide in the woods, wearing latex gloves to avoid leaving evidence. When Jason arrived, believing he was about to share a romantic moment with a girl he liked, they would attack him with weapons they had already acquired: a hatchet, a hammer, and rocks. They would kill him and take his $500 paycheck, money they planned to spend on drugs. Most chilling of all, this was not the first murder plot the group had conceived. Several weeks before Jason's murder, these same four teenagers had discussed breaking into the Sweeney family home while everyone slept and murdering Jason's entire family. Why they abandoned that plan and focused solely on Jason remains unclear, but the premeditation, the careful plotting over weeks, revealed minds that had crossed a boundary most humans never approach. As evening descended on Fishtown that Friday, Jason met Justina as planned. She smiled at him, took his hand perhaps, and suggested they go to the trails, the wooded area near the Delaware River where young people often went for privacy. Jason agreed, his heart full of anticipation, completely unaware that his best friend and three others were already hidden among the trees, waiting in the gathering darkness, latex gloves on their hands and murder weapons within reach. They walked together into the woods, following familiar paths between the trees. The sounds of the neighborhood faded behind them, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. They found a secluded spot, and Justina and Jason began to undress, the promised intimacy seemingly about to unfold. In that moment, Jason must have felt happy, perhaps excited about this new relationship, completely trusting and utterly vulnerable. Then the attack began. Edward Batzig, the boy who had been Jason's best friend for over a decade, struck the first blow. He swung a hatchet at Jason's head, hitting him 4 or 5 times with devastating force. Jason's confusion and terror must have been absolute as he tried to understand why his best friend was attacking him, why his head exploded with pain, why the girl beside him was not screaming or running, but standing there as 3 figures emerged from the darkness. The 3 young men descended on Jason together. Batzig continued striking with the hatchet, while the Koya brothers wielded a hammer and hurled rocks at his head and face. Jason tried to get up, his survival instinct driving him to escape even as blood poured from his wounds. He begged for his life, his voice breaking with desperation and disbelief. "Please stop, I'm bleeding," he cried out, looking directly at his best friend, the boy he had trusted with everything. Batzig responded by hitting him again with the hatchet. They kept hitting and hitting him. The attack was so ferocious, so sustained and brutal, that nearly every bone in Jason's face was broken. When he finally lay motionless on the ground, unconscious or perhaps already dead, they dropped a boulder on the right side of his head, crushing his skull completely. Of the many bones in Jason's face, only his left cheekbone remained intact. His face was so utterly destroyed that he would later have to be identified not by his features but by a cut on his hand, a small wound he had sustained during his construction work, a scar that marked him as a boy who had worked with his hands and earned his living honestly. The 4 teenagers stood over Jason Sweeney's body in the darkening woods near the Delaware River. Then they shared a group hug. "It was like we were all happy with what we did," Dominic Koya tell. They removed Jason's wallet from his body and split the $500 4 ways, each receiving $125. Then they left the trails, leaving Jason's broken body among the trees where he had gone seeking romance and found only betrayal and death. The 4 killers returned to Joshua Staub's house, their clothes splattered with their victim's blood. Staub, who had known about the murder plot, ran their bloody clothing through his washing machine. With their shares of Jason's money, they purchased drugs, embarking on a drug binge that showed no trace of remorse or horror at what they had just done. Justina Morley, according to Staub's testimony, expressed pleasure at having so much money. Meanwhile, in the Sweeney house, Paul and Dawn were growing concerned. Jason had not come home Friday night, which was unusual. When Saturday morning arrived, and he still had not returned or called, their worry deepened into fear. They contacted authorities, and filed a missing person report. Philadelphia police began searching for the 16-year-old construction worker who had vanished on a Friday night. On that same Saturday, police discovered an unidentified body in the wooded area called the Trails. The victim's face was so completely destroyed that visual identification was impossible. However, investigators noticed a distinguishing feature: a wound on the deceased's hand that was in the process of healing, clearly sustained before the fatal attack. They cross-referenced this detail with missing person reports and found a match with Jason Keel Sweeney, who his parents had reported as recently sustaining a cut to his hand at work. Paul and Dawn Sweeney were contacted and asked to come identify a body. When Dawn Sweeney arrived and learned that her precious boy, her firstborn son with the freckles still on his face, could only be identified by a scar on his hand because his face had been obliterated, something inside her shattered in a way that would never fully heal. My precious baby boy had been beaten to death so brutally that I had to identify him by a fresh scar on his hand, she would later testify, tears streaming down her face. The investigation moved swiftly. Acting on a tip, police arrested 4 teenagers in connection with Jason's murder. They took into custody Justina Morley, Dominic and Nicholas Koya, and Edward Batzig Jr. All 4 were charged with first-degree murder. As detectives interrogated the suspects, the horrifying details of the carefully planned execution began to emerge. Dominic Koya confessed to police, providing a detailed account of the murder plot and the attack itself. When a detective asked if he had been high on drugs during the killing, seeking perhaps some explanation for the incomprehensible brutality, Koya's answer was chilling. "No, I was as sober as I am now," he said, then added with what seemed like a glimmer of self-awareness, "It is sick, isn't it?" The case shocked Philadelphia and captured national media attention. The ages of the perpetrators, the extreme brutality of the murder, the fact that it was committed by the victim's own best friend and supposed girlfriend, and the apparent complete lack of remorse displayed by the killers combined to create a story that seemed almost incomprehensible. During a preliminary hearing on June 17, 2003, Judge Seamus Patrick McCaffrey reviewed the evidence and photographs of Jason's body. The judge, an experienced jurist who had presided over hundreds of murder cases, including many brutal ones, struggled to maintain his composure. "This one is beyond," he said to a defense lawyer. "This is barbaric. This is something out of the Dark Ages. Friends. Over $500. Why did they not simply rob Jason? Why was murder necessary?" Jason's father, Paul, believed he understood the true motive. "Jealousy," he said. "They were jealous that Jason was moving past them, growing beyond them as a good person. He wasn't hooked on drugs like the rest of them, and they wanted vengeance." While the killers claimed robbery as their motive, there was a cruel logic to Paul Sweeney's theory. Jason represented something his murderers could not stand: a peer who was making something of himself, who worked hard, who was not consumed by drug addiction, who had a future while they were drowning in addiction and self-destruction. In killing him, they destroyed not just a person, but a mirror that reflected their own failures. The case proceeded through the criminal justice system with 4 young lives now forfeit to varying degrees. Justina Morley, faced with overwhelming evidence and the testimony of Joshua Staub about her role and her satisfaction with the murder proceeds, accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to third-degree murder and agreed to testify against the 3 young men. In exchange, she was sentenced to 17.5 to 35 years in prison, meaning she would be approximately 30 years old when she became eligible for parole. The 3 males went to trial. In March 2005, nearly 2 years after Jason's murder, a jury convicted Dominic Koya, Nicholas Koya, and Edward Batzig Jr. of first-degree murder. All 3 received mandatory sentences of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for robbery and related offenses. Prosecutors had initially sought the death penalty against Dominic Koya, who had been 17 at the time of the murder, but a Supreme Court ruling banned states from executing anyone for crimes committed before they were 18. After the verdict, Paul Sweeney spoke to reporters. My son got justice today, he said simply. That's all I cared about. The system worked today. But justice, while important, could not restore what had been taken. In the Sweeney row house in Fishtown, photographs of Jason dominated the walls alongside pictures of his 4 siblings. Dawn Sweeney wore a locket containing Jason's hair around her neck, carrying her son close to her heart because she could no longer hold him in her arms. Years later, when Nicholas Koya came up for resentencing due to a Supreme Court ruling regarding juvenile sentences, Jason's mother and sister appeared in court to ensure his life sentence was upheld. Dawn Sweeney testified again about the horror of identifying her son by a scar on his hand. Jason's sister, Melissa Vereb, spoke about her brother and asked that Nicholas Koya's sentence stand, arguing he was incapable of change. On February 19, 2015, Judge Sandy L. V. Bird sentenced Nicholas Koya to life in prison without the possibility of parole, upholding the original sentence. This is an uncommon case, Judge Bird stated. There are no factors which remove the defendant from the punishment of life in prison without parole. Not only did he plan the assault, but he participated in the assault, which was so violent that Jason Sweeney had to be identified with dental records. The murder of Jason Keel Sweeney represents a darkness that occasionally erupts in human affairs, a reminder that evil sometimes wears the face of friendship and speaks with the voice of affection. Jason went to his death trusting people who had shared years of his life, believing in the fundamental goodness of his best friend, hoping for romance with a girl who was leading him to slaughter. His murder was not a crime of passion or a moment of rage gone too far. It was calculated, planned over weeks, executed with latex gloves and multiple weapons, and followed by celebration. In the years since Jason's death, Fishtown has changed. The neighborhood has gentrified, with young professionals moving into renovated row houses, trendy restaurants replacing corner bars. But the trails remain, a wooded area by the Delaware River where teenagers still seek privacy, and where, on a Friday evening in May 2003, a 16-year-old boy with freckles on his face and dreams in his heart had those dreams crushed beneath a boulder wielded by people he considered friends. Jason Keel Sweeney worked construction with his father. He earned his money honestly. He was loyal to his friends, even when they did not deserve his loyalty. He was 16 years old, with his entire life ahead of him, when 4 people who should have cared for him decided his life was worth less than $500 and a drug-fueled party. His story serves as a stark reminder of how fragile life can be, how misplaced trust can turn fatal, and how the human capacity for cruelty sometimes defies all understanding. Jason deserved so much better than the fate that befell him on that spring evening. He deserved to grow up, to become the man he was working so hard to be, to build a life and perhaps a family, to experience all the joys and sorrows that make up a full human existence. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, a victim whose name reminds us that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers in dark alleys, but from familiar faces promising friendship and love. Story 6. In the sprawling, verdant expanse of Moscow's Bitsa Park, where birch trees whispered secrets to the wind, and the city's pulse seemed to fade into a quieter rhythm, a darkness lurked. It was not the kind of darkness that came with the setting sun or the shadows cast by towering trees. This was a human darkness, one that wore a deceptively ordinary face, carried a hammer in its pocket, and marked its grim progress on the squares of a chessboard. His name was Alexander Yuryevich Pichushkin, though the world would come to know him as the chessboard killer, a man whose quiet demeanor belied a monstrous ambition to claim a life for every square on a chessboard, 64 in all. This is the story of a killer who turned a park into a graveyard, a community into a crucible of fear, and a courtroom into a stage for his unrepentant confession. It is a tale of tragedy, obsession, and the fragile line between humanity and horror, woven from the threads of a real case that shook Moscow to its core. The story begins in the spring of 1974 in Mytishi, a working-class suburb north of Moscow, where Alexander Pichushkin entered the world. Born on April 9, He was a child of modest means, raised in a small apartment on Kersenskaya Street with his mother, Natalia, his younger half-sister, her husband, and their son. The apartment was cramped, a two-bedroom space on the 5th floor, but it was home, a place where the sounds of family life, laughter, arguments, the clink of dishes filled the air. Vitsa Park, a sprawling green space in southern Moscow, was just a 6-minute walk away, its paths and clearings a playground for the young Alexander. To those who knew him then, he was a sociable boy, quick with a smile and eager to please. His eyes, dark and curious, seemed to take in the world with an intensity that hinted at something deeper, though no one could have guessed what lay beneath. But childhood is a fragile thing, and for Alexander, it was marked by a single pivotal moment. At the age of 4, he tumbled backward off a swing in a local park. As he struggled to sit up, dazed and disoriented, the swing arced back and struck him in the forehead. The impact was severe, a blunt force that left more than a bruise. Doctors later speculated that the blow damaged his frontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and empathy. In a child's still developing brain, such an injury could be catastrophic, rewiring the delicate balance of personality and restraint. His mother, Natalia, would later point to this accident as the root of her son's descent, a moment when the boy she knew began to slip away. As Alexander grew, the effects of that injury became apparent. The once sociable child turned hostile, his moods unpredictable. At school, his peers sensed his difference, taunting him with cruel nicknames like retard. The bullying was relentless, a daily assault that fueled his growing anger. His mother, hoping to protect him, transferred him to a school for children with learning disabilities, but the move only deepened his sense of isolation. It was his maternal grandfather who saw something else in Alexander, a spark of intelligence that the school system seemed determined to overlook. He took the boy under his wing, moving him into his own home and encouraging him to pursue intellectual interests. It was here, in the quiet moments with his grandfather, that Alexander discovered chess. Chess was more than a game for Alexander. It was a battlefield where he could channel his aggression, outwit his opponents, and assert control. In Vitsa Park, where elderly men gathered to play under the shade of trees, Alexander found his stage. He was a prodigy, his mind sharp and calculating, able to anticipate moves with uncanny precision. The old men, weathered by life and vodka, were no match for the teenager who dominated the board with a quiet intensity. For a time, chess seemed to anchor him, giving him a way to navigate the chaos within. But when his grandfather died, the anchor was lost. Alexander returned to his mother's apartment. His grief mingling with the vodka, he began to consume in ever larger quantities. The game that had once been his salvation now took on a darker significance, its 64 squares becoming a blueprint for something far more sinister. The first murder came in 1992, when Alexander was just 18. His victim was Mikhail Odichuk, a classmate and friend who had once shared his dreams of rebellion. The two had plotted together, fantasizing about a killing spree that would rival the notorious Andrei Chikatilo, a Soviet serial killer who had murdered 52 women and children before his execution in 1994. But when they met in Vitsa Park to put their plan into action, Mikhail hesitated, unwilling to cross the line from fantasy to reality. Alexander, however, felt betrayed, his rage ignited by his friend's refusal. In a secluded corner of the park, he strangled Mikhail and dumped his body into a sewer entrance, the dark water swallowing the evidence. The body was never found, and when police questioned Alexander, he claimed he had left Mikhail unharmed. With no evidence to hold him, they let him go. For nearly a decade, Alexander's killing urge lay dormant, suppressed by the fear of discovery or perhaps by the lack of opportunity. But in 2001, something shifted. Russia's moratorium on the death penalty, enacted in 1996, emboldened him. The absence of capital punishment meant that even if caught, he would not face execution. On May 17, 2001, he lured Yevgeny Pronin, a 52-year-old man he met while playing chess in Vitsa Park, to a secluded spot. Promising a drink to mourn the anniversary of his dog's death, A fabricated excuse. Alexander offered Pronine vodka. As the older man drank, Alexander struck him in the head with the bottle, then threw his body into a well. It was a clean kill, efficient and untraceable, and it awakened something in Alexander. The act was not just about power, it was about life itself. "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food for you," he would later say. "I killed in order to live." From 2001 to 2005, Alexander's murders followed a pattern. He targeted the vulnerable, elderly men, homeless drunks, those society had cast aside. Bitsa Park, with its dense woods and hidden corners, became his hunting ground. He would approach his victims with a smile, offering vodka and companionship. They would drink together, the alcohol dulling their senses, until Alexander struck, usually with a hammer or a bottle to the back of the head. Some he pushed into the park's sewage canals, letting the dark water claim them. Others he left where they fell, their bodies marked by his signature, a stick or vodka bottle thrust into their shattered skulls. He killed with a chilling efficiency, claiming 11 lives in 2001 alone, 6 in a single month. To him, it was a game, each victim a piece moved across his mental chessboard, each death a step closer to his goal of 64. In his cramped apartment, Alexander kept a physical chessboard, its squares marked with bottle tops or numbers to track his kills. It was a macabre tally, a testament to his obsession. He lived a double life, working as a grocery clerk by day, his demeanor polite and unassuming. Coworkers described him as disciplined, even tactful, a man who blended seamlessly into the rhythm of ordinary life. But at night, in the shadowed paths of Bitsa Park, he was a predator, his dark eyes scanning for the next victim. The park, once a place of solace for Moscow's residents, became a place of dread. People began to avoid its paths, whispering about the Bitsa maniac who struck without warning. By 2005, the body count was rising, and the city was gripped by fear. Alexander's methods grew more brutal as time passed. In October 2005, he abandoned the secrecy of the sewers, choosing instead to leave his victims' bodies in plain sight. His kills became more vicious, the hammer blows more frenzied. He would strike from behind, ensuring his clothes remained free of blood, then insert a vodka bottle into the wound, a grotesque signature that seemed to mock the very act of drinking that had lured his victims to their deaths. He began to target not just the elderly and homeless, but younger men, women, and even children. The park's tall birch trees, once symbols of serenity, became hiding places for a killer who thrived on surprise. To Alexander, each murder was a ritual, a way to assert his godlike power over life and death. "I was judge, prosecutor, and executioner," he would later tell the court, his voice devoid of remorse. The turning point came in June 2006, when Alexander approached Marina Moskolyova, a 36-year-old co-worker at the grocery store. She was wary of him, sensing something off in his quiet demeanor, but he persuaded her to join him for a walk in Bitsa Park, claiming he wanted to visit his dog's grave. Before leaving, Marina left a note for her son, detailing her plans and including Alexander's phone number. It was a small act, born of instinct, but it would prove to be his undoing. In the park, Alexander followed his usual pattern, offering vodka and waiting until Marina was intoxicated. Then, with a hammer, he struck, leaving her body in the woods with his signature bottle in her skull. But this time, the police had a lead. Marina's note led them to Alexander, and a review of Moscow metro surveillance footage showed her walking with him hours before her death. On June 16, 2006, police arrested him at his mother's apartment. The interrogation room was stark, its walls a dull gray that seemed to absorb the light. Alexander sat across from the detectives, his posture relaxed, almost defiant. He confessed readily, his voice calm as he recounted his crimes in chilling detail. He led police to the scenes in Bitsa Park, reenacting each murder with a precision that unnerved even the most seasoned officers. He showed them his chessboard, its squares nearly filled, and claimed he had killed 61 people, though prosecutors could only confirm 48 murders and 3 attempted murders. He spoke of his desire to surpass Andrei Chikatilo, to become Russia's most prolific killer. "I killed so I could live myself," he said. You kill someone and immediately you feel relieved, your shoulders straighten up, and you want to live. The trial began in September 2007 at Moscow City Court, a cavernous room filled with the weight of grief and outrage. Alexander stood in a reinforced glass cage, his hands often cuffed behind his back, his face pale and expressionless. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' relatives, and curious onlookers, all drawn to the spectacle of a man who had turned murder into a game. The prosecution, led by Yuri Simon, presented a meticulous case, detailing each killing with forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Alexander's own confessions. The jury, tasked with deciding his fate, listened as the list of charges, 48 murders and 3 attempted murders, was read aloud, a litany of horror that took over an hour to complete. The victims' families sat in the front rows, their faces etched with pain. Tatiana Vlasova clutched a photograph of her son Vladimir, one of Alexander's victims, her eyes brimming with tears as she listened to the details of his death. Another woman, whose father had been lured to the park with the promise of vodka, shook her head in disbelief, unable to reconcile the polite grocery clerk with the monster in the cage. The evidence was overwhelming. The chessboard, the surveillance footage, the bodies found with vodka bottles embedded in their skulls. Yet Alexander remained unrepentant, even defiant. In his final statement, he rejected the charge of cruelty, calling his murders a ritual, my style, my handwriting. He boasted of deciding the fate of 60 people, claiming he had been their judge and executioner. On October 24, 2007, after just over 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty on all counts, with no mitigating circumstances. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of relief and anger, the families of the victims clutching each other for support. Prosecutors called for a life sentence, with the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement, citing Alexander's sadistic inclination toward murder. Despite his claims of psychiatric issues in childhood, experts at Russia's main psychiatric clinic deemed him sane, fully aware of the criminal nature of his actions. On October 29th, Judge Vladimir Yusov delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment in a hard labor colony, the harshest punishment available under Russian law, which had abolished the death penalty as part of its obligations to the Council of Europe. As the judge read the sentence, Alexander stood in his glass cage, his expression unchanging. When asked if he understood, he replied curtly, "I'm not deaf." For the families, the sentence was bittersweet. "Justice has been done," Yuri Simon declared, but for Tatiana Vlasova and others, no punishment could undo their loss. "He should have been treated as an exceptional case and given a death sentence," Tatiana said, her voice trembling as she held her son's photograph. Alexander's lack of remorse only deepened their pain. He had called himself almost God, declaring that the notions of good and evil are relative things. To him, the lives he took were mere moves in a game, each one bringing him closer to his macabre goal. The impact of Alexander Pichushkin's crimes rippled far beyond the courtroom. Vitsa Park, once a haven for families and chess players, became a symbol of fear, its paths avoided by all but the bravest or most desperate. The community around Khersenskaya Street, where 10 of his victims had lived in the same 4-building complex as Alexander, grappled with the chilling realization that a killer had walked among them, unnoticed. His mother, Natalia, insisted that the swing accident had changed her son, turning a bright boy into a monster. But for those who had lost loved ones, such explanations offered little comfort. The park's trees, its sewers, its very air seemed tainted by the bloodshed, a reminder of the fragility of safety in a city of millions. Alexander's story is not just one of crime, but of the human capacity for darkness. His childhood injury, his isolation, his obsession with chess, all were pieces of a puzzle that formed a killer. Yet they do not fully explain the choice to kill, the deliberate steps he took to lure, deceive, and destroy. His victims were not just numbers on a chessboard, they were people with lives, families, and stories of their own. Yevgeny Pronin, who shared a drink with a seemingly friendly chess player, Marina Mosklyova, who left a note that saved others, Vladimir Vlasov, whose mother carried his memory in a worn photograph. They were the human cost of Alexander's game. In the years since his conviction, Alexander Pichushkin has remained in a Russian prison, his life sentence ensuring he will never walk free. His chessboard, now evidence in a police archive, stands as a grim relic of his crimes. Bitsa Park has slowly reclaimed its place as a community space, though the scars of his reign linger in the collective memory of Moscow. The case of the chessboard killer remains a haunting chapter in the city's history, a reminder that evil can wear the face of an ordinary man, blending into the crowd until it chooses to strike. For those who lived through it, the story is not just about a killer, but about the resilience of a community, the grief of those left behind, and the enduring question of what drives a man to see murder as a game, and life as a prize to be taken. Story 7. The city of Shenzhen pulsed with an electric hum, a sprawling metropolis where neon lights reflected off glass towers and the air thrummed with the relentless rhythm of industry. In 2020, it was a beacon of China's economic miracle, a special economic zone that had transformed from a fishing village into a global hub of technology and manufacturing. Factories churned out smartphones, drones, and circuit boards, their assembly lines staffed by millions of migrant workers who poured in from rural provinces, chasing dreams of a better life. But beneath the city's gleaming surface, there were shadows, places where desperation festered, where the weight of long hours and low wages pressed down like a vice. It was in one of these shadows, in a nondescript factory dormitory tucked away in the Bowen district, that a tragedy unfolded, one that would come to be known as the Shenzhen factory worker murders. Li Wei was one of those workers, a 23-year-old from Hunan province with a shy smile and calloused hands. He had arrived in Shenzhen 2 years earlier, leaving behind a village of crumbling brick houses and fields parched by drought. His parents, weathered by years of farming, had pinned their hopes on him, their only son, to lift them out of poverty. Li Wei worked at a factory that assembled components for smartphones, his days a blur of repetitive tasks under the glare of fluorescent lights. The work was grueling, 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, with only a brief pause for meals in a crowded canteen. His dormitory, a concrete block shared with 7 other men, was a place of restless sleep and whispered complaints. Yet Li Wei endured, driven by the promise of sending money home, of building a future beyond the factory's walls. On a humid night in July 2020, the dormitory was quieter than usual. The summer heat clung to the air, and most of Li Wei's roommates were sprawled on their bunks, exhausted from the day's labor. Outside, the distant hum of machinery mingled with the chirping of cicadas. Li Wei sat on the edge of his bed, scribbling in a worn notebook, a habit he'd kept since childhood. He wrote about his dreams, about returning to Hunan with enough savings to marry his childhood sweetheart, May. But that night, his pen paused mid-sentence. A shadow moved in the doorway, and before he could react, a figure lunged forward, a blade glinting in the dim light. Li Wei's scream was cut short, swallowed by the oppressive heat and the indifference of the sleeping city. By morning, the dormitory was a scene of horror. Li Wei and 3 of his roommates, Chen Tao, Zhang Chong, and Lu Jun, lay dead, their bodies sprawled across the floor, blood pooling beneath them. The other 4 men in the room were gone, their belongings untouched, as if they had vanished into the night. The factory's security guard, a grizzled man named Wang, discovered the bodies during his morning rounds. His shouts echoed through the courtyard, drawing a crowd of bleary-eyed workers. The scene was chaotic, with whispers of fear and confusion spreading like wildfire. Who could have done this? And why? The Shenzhen police descended on the factory within hours, their presence a stark contrast to the usual rhythm of the assembly line. Officers in crisp uniforms cordoned off the dormitory, their faces grim as they surveyed the carnage. The victims, all young men in their early 20s, had been stabbed multiple times, the wounds precise and brutal. The lack of defensive marks suggested they had been caught off guard, perhaps in their sleep. The missing roommates, four men named Zhao Ming, Huang Bo, Sun Jie, and Su Wei were nowhere to be found. Their absence was suspicious, but the police were cautious, aware of the city's complex social fabric and the transient nature of its workforce. Detective Zhang Mei, a seasoned investigator with the Shenzhen Public Security Bureau, took charge of the case. She was a woman of quiet intensity, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Born in a small town not unlike the ones the victims had come from, she understood the lives of migrant workers, their hopes, their struggles, and the invisibility that cloaked them in a city that valued output over individuals. Zhang Mei walked through the dormitory, her boots sticking slightly to the blood-streaked floor. She noted the sparse furnishings, 8 metal bunks, a single fan rattling in the corner, and a scattering of personal items, a faded photograph, a pair of worn sneakers, Li Wei's notebook. The pages were stained with blood, but she could make out his neat handwriting, the words filled with longing for a life he would never live. The investigation began with urgency, driven by the need to quell the growing panic among the factory's workers. Shenzhen was a city built on the backs of migrants, and any threat to their safety could ripple outward, disrupting the delicate balance of labor and production. Zhang Mei interviewed the surviving workers, piecing together fragments of the victims' lives. Li Wei was described as quiet but kind, always sharing his meals with those who had none. Chen Tao was the joker, his laughter a rare bright spot in the dormitory. Zhang Chong was ambitious, talking endlessly of starting his own business. Lu Jun, the youngest, was shy, often homesick, clutching a letter from his mother during breaks. The 4 missing men, however, were harder to pin down. Their co-workers described them as distant, keeping to themselves, their backgrounds vague even by the standards of migrant life. As the days passed, the investigation uncovered troubling details. The factory, owned by a mid-sized electronics firm, had a reputation for cutting corners. Wages were often delayed, and overtime was mandatory, with workers clocking up to 70 hours a week. The dormitory was overcrowded, the conditions barely meeting legal standards. Zhang Mei learned of tensions among the workers, particularly between the victims and the missing men. Zhao Ming, the de facto leader of the 4, had a temper, often clashing with Li Wei over small things. A borrowed charger, a spilled bowl of noodles. Huang Bo was known for his gambling, his debts piling up in the underground betting rings that thrived in Shenzhen's back alleys. Sun Jie and Su Wei were quieter, but their loyalty to Zhao suggested they followed his lead. The breakthrough came a week later, when a tip led police to a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. Zhao Ming, Huang Bo, Sun Jie, and Su Wei were found hiding there, their clothes stained with blood that would later be matched to the victims. Under interrogation, the story began to unravel, though the truth was as murky as the Pearl River Delta's waters. Zhao Ming, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, confessed to the killings, but his account was laced with contradictions. He claimed the murders were a spur-of-the-moment act, triggered by an argument over money. Li Wei, he said, had discovered that Zhao was skimming from a communal savings pool the roommates had set up, a fund meant to help them survive the factory's erratic pay schedule. When Li Wei threatened to report him, Zhao snapped, grabbing a knife from the dormitory's small kitchen. The others, he said, were collateral damage, killed to eliminate witnesses. But Zhang Mei wasn't convinced. The precision of the wounds, the absence of a struggle, and the fact that the 4 men had fled together suggested premeditation. She pressed Zhao, her questions sharp and unrelenting. Under pressure, he revealed a deeper motive, a dispute rooted in the factory's underground economy. The 4 men had been running a side hustle, selling stolen components from the factory to black market dealers. Li Wei, ever the idealist, had stumbled upon their scheme and confronted them, threatening to go to the factory manager. For men like Zhao, who lived on the edge of survival, exposure meant not just losing their jobs, but facing prison in a country where the law was unforgiving. The decision to kill was made in a moment of panic, but the execution was chillingly deliberate. The arrests brought little comfort to the victims' families, who gathered in Shenzhen to claim their sons' bodies. Li Wei's parents, frail and stooped, wept openly as they clutched his notebook, The page is now a sacred relic of a life cut short. Chun Tao's sister, a factory worker herself, spoke of his dreams of opening a small shop back home. Zhang Chong's father, a farmer with hands like leather, cursed the city that had promised prosperity but delivered death. Lu Jun's mother collapsed at the sight of his body, her grief a raw wound that silenced the room. The family's pain was a stark reminder of the human cost of Shenzhen's relentless growth, a city where progress often came at the expense of those who fueled it. The trial, held in early 2021, was a media spectacle, though tightly controlled by the Chinese government. The Shenzhen Intermediate People's Court was a fortress of concrete and glass, its halls echoing with the weight of justice. Zhao Ming, Huang Bo, Sun Jie, and Su Wei stood trial for murder, with Zhao facing additional charges of theft and conspiracy. The prosecution painted a damning picture. For men driven by greed and fear, willing to kill to protect their illicit gains. The defense argued that the factory's harsh conditions had pushed them to desperation, a claim that resonated with many workers watching from the sidelines. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters but with migrant workers who saw in the case a reflection of their own precarious lives. Zhang Mei testified, her voice steady as she recounted the investigation. She described the blood-soaked dormitory, the victims' dreams, and the betrayal that ended their lives. The evidence was overwhelming: DNA on the knife, security footage showing the 4 men fleeing the factory, and Zhao's own confession, however muddled. The families sat in the gallery, their faces etched with grief and anger. The trial lasted 3 weeks, each day a grueling recounting of the night that had shattered so many lives. On the final day, the judge delivered the verdict. Zhao Ming was sentenced to death, with Huang Bo, Sun Jie, and Su Wei receiving life imprisonment. The courtroom was silent, the weight of the sentences settling over everyone present. For Shenzhen, the murders were a fleeting scandal, quickly overshadowed by the city's relentless pace. The factory resumed operations within days, its assembly lines humming as if nothing had happened. But for those touched by the case, the scars lingered. Zhang Mei returned to her desk, her resolve hardened, but her faith in the system shaken. She knew that the conditions that had bred such violence, poverty, exploitation, desperation, were still there, festering in the city's shadows. The families returned to their villages, their grief a private burden in a country that valued progress over mourning. Li Wei's notebook, now in his mother's hands, became a symbol of what might have been. She read his words late at night, her fingers tracing the characters he'd written with such hope. Shenzhen, for her, was no longer a city of opportunity, but a place of loss, a reminder that dreams could be as fragile as the lives that held them. The Shenzhen factory worker murders faded from the headlines, but they left behind a question that lingered in the humid air. In a city built on the backs of the desperate, how many more tragedies were waiting to unfold?